What comes to your mind when you hear the words, the discovery of America? 3 ships cutting through the waves, a bold Christopher Columbus staring into the horizon, or maybe feathered warriors on the shore watching strangers approach. You see, this phrase, discovery of America, is one of the most misleading in history. Discovery, as if the continent had been sitting there, empty, waiting for someone to plant a flag in it. But the truth is very different. When Europeans arrived, America was already full of life. Millions of people lived there, speaking hundreds of languages, building cities, raising temples, following their gods, and governing vast empires. Tonight, I want to take you beyond the sails of Columbus. We'll step back into a world that existed before Europeans ever thought of crossing the ocean. We'll look at who lived there, how they built their cities, how they ruled their people, and what they believed about the world around them. Only then can we understand what was really lost and what was set in motion when 2 worlds collided. Forget Columbus for a moment. Imagine instead a vast continent, a place where civilizations flourished as sophisticated and dazzling as those in Europe, Egypt, or China. When Europeans still crowded into medieval towns, across the ocean there were pyramids rising into the jungle sky, mountain roads spanning thousands of miles, and political systems that look surprisingly modern even today. Let's start with the Maya. They lived in the steamy jungles of the Yucatan and carved their cities from stone. Places like Chichen Itza, Palenque, and Tikal weren't little villages. They were true cities with grand plazas and stepped pyramids towering above the trees. Picture priests in feathered headdresses, bustling markets, and the echo of a ball game where, sometimes, losing meant death. The Maya were brilliant mathematicians and astronomers. Their calendar tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, even Venus, with a precision that stuns scientists today. And while Europe still clung to clumsy Roman numerals, the Maya had already discovered the concept of zero. Later, the Aztecs rose to power. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, stood on a lake, with stone causeways linking it to the mainland. Imagine a city so large and vibrant it rivaled any European capital of the 15th century. 200,000 people living on artificial islands, travelling by canoe through canals, and crowding vast markets filled with cacao beans, jade ornaments, and colourful fabrics. But the Aztec Empire was built on war. Conquered tribes were forced to pay tribute in food, goods, and sometimes in people. Captives were marched to temples for sacrifice, blood and hearts offered to the gods to keep the sun rising each morning. Brutal, yes. But for the Aztecs, war and religion were inseparable, and their empire thrived on both. Now, travel south to the towering Andes. Here, the Inca created one of the most remarkable empires in history. Harsh mountains, thin air, rocky slopes, and yet they built an empire that stretched thousands of miles along the spine of South America. They carved roads into the mountains, roads so well built that many still exist today. They had no wheels for transport, no horses, but they used llamas to carry goods and invented the quipu, a system of knotted strings that recorded taxes, harvests, and armies. Think of it as a data network made of rope. Their capital, Cusco, was called the navel of the world. Its stone walls were so precisely fitted that even now, you can't slide a knife blade between the blocks. And high in the mountains, Machu Picchu shows the Inca genius for terraced farming and monumental architecture. The empire was ruled by the Sapa Inca, the son of the sun. It was a centralized, disciplined society. Farmers gave part of their harvest to the state, and in return, the empire stored food in massive warehouses to protect people against famine. Strict, yes, but also surprisingly efficient. Further north, life looked different. There were no great stone empires here, But that doesn't mean life was simple. On the Great Plains, hunters followed the great bison herds. Their homes, the teepee tents, could be assembled and taken down in hours, perfectly suited for a mobile way of life. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy created something extraordinary, a political league of tribes bound together by what they called the Great Law of Peace. Picture councils of chiefs debating war and peace, decisions made collectively, not by a single ruler. Many historians believe that centuries later, the framers of the US Constitution drew inspiration from this system. And here lies the greatest contrast of all. In Europe, land was something to own, to buy, to fence off, to exhaust. Nature was a resource to be exploited. For many native cultures, land wasn't property, it was sacred. The earth, the rivers, the forests, the animals, all were alive, part of a spiritual family. Hunters gave thanks to the spirits of the animals they killed. Farmers prayed to the earth for crops. Mountains and lakes were not just landmarks. They were beings with power and presence. This difference, ownership versus belonging, would become a fault line. When Europeans arrived, they came with contracts, swords, and deeds. The native peoples came with traditions of balance and gratitude. Those two visions of the world could never fully fit together. To understand how Europe ended up on the shores of America, we need to picture what was happening there in the 15th century. At this time, Europe wasn't yet the world ruler it would later become. It was more like a tangle of kingdoms locked in endless rivalries for power, trade routes, and influence. In the south, Spain had just finished the long Reconquista. In 1492, the last Muslim stronghold, Granada, fell. Power was consolidated under two monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their marriage made Spain stronger, but the wars had drained the treasury. Spain's rulers were now hungry for new wealth, new glory, and preferably new lands. Meanwhile, Portugal was racing ahead in exploration. Its ships had already charted the coast of Africa and were searching for a sea route to India to bypass the expensive overland trade routes. France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire weren't standing still either. Wars, plots, and rivalries consumed the continent. And what about ordinary people? Life for peasants was hard. Taxes, feudal duties, disease. Most lived on the edge of hunger. Harvests depended on the weather, and towns often suffered from plagues. Europe knew famine, war, and poverty. And so the rumours of lands of gold and spices across the seas fired imaginations. If there really was a world overflowing with riches, someone would risk everything to find it. This is where Christopher Columbus enters the stage. Born in Genoa, son of a wool merchant, he spent his youth at sea. But he had one burning idea. The earth is round, and if you sail west, you can reach India, land of silk, spices, and gold. The catch? Not everyone agreed with his optimism. Scholars already knew the earth was round, but they disagreed about its size. Columbus believed Asia was only a few thousand kilometers away. In truth, the distance was many times greater. And if the Americas hadn't been there, his ships would likely have perished in the open ocean. He spent years knocking on royal doors. He pitched his plan to Portugal, Genoa, Venice, all said no. Too risky, too expensive. But in Spain, fresh from victory in the Reconquista, he found an audience. Ferdinand and Isabella, eager for new opportunities, finally agreed. After much negotiation, they gave Columbus 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Of course, the decision wasn't pure romance. Spain wanted to beat Portugal in the race for new lands and trade routes. Nobles and merchants hungered for profit. Columbus wasn't backed because everyone believed in his brilliant theory, but because Spain was willing to gamble. If his shortcut to India worked, they'd become the richest nation in Europe. Columbus signed a special contract. If he found new lands, he would be made viceroy and receive a share of the wealth. For a Genoese sailor, this was an unimaginable leap, from captain to ruler. On August 3, 1492, the three caravels sailed from Spain. The journey was grueling. Sailors grew restless, terrified of being lost forever in an endless ocean. Weeks passed without sight of land. Mutiny simmered. Columbus pushed forward, steady and determined. Then, in October 1492, land appeared on the horizon. They thought it was India. In reality, it was the Bahamas. That mistake gave us the word Indians, a name that stuck to the native peoples for centuries. At first, encounters were cautious and even friendly. The islanders looked curiously at these bearded men in iron armor, with their shining swords and massive ships. They traded parrots, food and ornaments for trinkets like glass beads and bells. To the locals, these were strange but fascinating visitors. To Columbus, it was proof that India must be near. But curiosity quickly turned into violence. The Spaniards demanded gold. They pressed the locals to reveal where it was, took hostages, and sometimes enslaved them. In his reports, Columbus described the islanders as gentle and trusting, easy to convert to Christianity, easy to rule. What had begun as a meeting of two worlds, within months, revealed the imbalance. One side saw neighbors, the other saw subjects and treasure. And that mindset would shape everything that followed. When the first rumors of new lands reached Europe, imaginations caught fire. People whispered that across the ocean were kingdoms where gold lay almost underfoot, where palaces gleamed with precious stones, and where locals would happily trade treasures for beads or mirrors. For a Europe exhausted by wars and poverty, it sounded like a fairy tale. Kings dreamed of filling their treasuries, while adventurers longed to make their fortunes overnight. In this feverish atmosphere, sailors, mercenaries, and missionaries set sail for the New World. What drove them was not only curiosity, but also greed, ambition, and the promise of glory. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico. He had only about 500 soldiers, a few cannons and horses. Strange, terrifying beasts to the local people. But his greatest weapon was cunning, the ability to turn old rivalries into alliances. At the time, the Aztec Empire was powerful but deeply hated by its neighbors. The Aztecs demanded heavy tribute and took prisoners for human sacrifices. Many tribes were eager to see them fall. Cortés made alliances, gathered native armies, and marched step by step toward the grand capital, Tenochtitlan. When the Spaniards first entered the city, they were stunned. Towers, palaces, temples, canals. Tenochtitlan was larger and more sophisticated than most European cities of the time. But admiration quickly gave way to greed. The Spaniards demanded gold, interfered with priests, and tension boiled over. After months of battles and blockade, in 1521, the city fell. On its ruins, the Spaniards built a new capital, Mexico City. Thus ended the story of a mighty empire. A similar tragedy unfolded further south. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro, with just 168 men, entered the vast Inca Empire in Peru. The empire was rich and orderly, with stone temples, roads stretching for thousands of miles, and a complex system of government. But civil war had weakened it. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were locked in a brutal fight for the throne. Pizarro exploited the chaos. He invited Atahualpa to a meeting and ambushed him. The Incas paid a ransom beyond imagination, rooms filled with gold and silver, but Atahualpa was executed anyway. With their ruler gone, the empire crumbled. Soon after, Cusco, the Inca capital, was in Spanish hands. But the deadliest conqueror wasn't a sword or cannon. It was a disease. The Spaniards brought smallpox, measles, and influenza, illnesses unknown in the Americas. For native peoples with no immunity, the epidemics were apocalyptic. Entire villages vanished. Priests and chiefs could offer no cure, and faith in their power collapsed. Historians estimate that within the first century after Columbus, as much as 80 to 90% of the native population of the Americas perished. Some people disappeared without ever seeing a European face to face. The land was conquered, cities burned, and treasures shipped off to Europe. But someone still had to work the fields and mines. Native people, weakened by disease and forced labor, died in staggering numbers. And so the Spaniards turned elsewhere. The first enslaved Africans were brought to the New World in the early 1500s. Shackled, packed into ships, many died on the way. Those who survived became the backbone of colonial economies, cutting sugarcane, digging in silver mines, working plantations under the lash. For Europe, this was the beginning of an age of unimaginable riches. Galleons sailed home heavy with gold and silver. But for the peoples of the Americas and Africa, it was an age of death, loss, and unending suffering. The great drama of discovery was, in truth, a tragedy for millions. Once it became clear that across the ocean lay unimaginable riches, Europe stirred with excitement. Spain and Portugal were the first to seize the initiative. Spain pushed westward into the Americas, while Portugal secured footholds in Africa and carved routes toward India. But other nations, France and England, had no intention of being left behind. The seas turned into a battlefield. Portuguese ships shadowed Spanish galleons, while the French and English sent out privateers, licensed pirates, to snatch gold and silver on the open waters. This was the beginning of a long age of naval wars and duels between empires, with not just treasure, but entire continents at stake. But even before France and England made their moves, Spain and Portugal decided to split the world between themselves. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. Imagine this. Two kingdoms sat down and drew an imaginary line across the globe. Everything to the east would belong to Portugal, everything to the west to Spain. Absurd, absolutely. But to the kings of that time, it seemed perfectly fair. As a result, Brazil went to Portugal, while nearly all the rest of the Americas became Spain's domain. The other European nations could only grit their teeth. The world had been divided without them. France and England weren't about to accept that arrangement. They began sending expeditions of their own, searching for a northwest passage to Asia and planting the first settlements along the coast of North America. Their sailors raided Spanish treasure fleets, while their kings quietly encouraged it. After all, Spain was becoming dangerously rich and powerful thanks to its American gold. And so, the New World became a battlefield not only between Europeans and native peoples, but also among Europe's own great powers. Yet Europe's steel and cannons weren't the only reasons for conquest. Just as decisive were the betrayals and alliances forged among the native peoples themselves. Cortés could never have taken Tenochtitlan without the help of the Aztecs' enemies. Pizarro could not have broken the Inca Empire without the factions eager to overthrow Atahualpa. For many tribes, the arrival of Europeans seemed like a chance to get revenge, to free themselves from tribute, to weaken hated rulers. But this choice proved fatal. The same Spaniards who posed as allies soon turned their weapons against yesterday's friends. Power was never meant to be shared. The conquerors played the game of divide and rule, and it worked all too well. In the end, the conquest of the Americas looked less like exploration and more like a vast chessboard. Spain and Portugal divided the world on parchment. England and France defied the lines with their ships, while native peoples became pawns in someone else's game. What began as daring adventures of a few captains soon revealed itself as something much larger. Across the ocean, the fate of the world was being decided, and the stakes could not have been higher. When the first caravans of gold, silver, pearls, and spices returned to Spain, Europe shivered with excitement. Royal treasuries overflowed, cities buzzed with new markets, and nobles felt they were witnessing magic. Wealth that had once seemed like a fairy tale had become reality. Spain became the first true global empire. Colonies in the Americas gave them control over new resources and markets, and soon Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands followed. This marked the beginning of the colonial age, where continents became interconnected, and the wealth of some nations was built on the suffering of others. The oceans, which had long been barriers, turned into highways of trade. Silk and spices from Asia, gold and silver from the Americas, enslaved labor from Africa. All of this laid the foundation for the emerging global economy. Europe gained the tools to transform the world into a connected system of exchange, trade, and power. For the native peoples of the Americas, the consequences were catastrophic. Millions died from diseases for which they had no immunity. The empires of the Aztecs and Incas collapsed. Cities were burned or destroyed, and much of their cultural heritage was lost. Yet, from the ruins of the old world, something new emerged. Mixed cultures appeared: mestizos, Creoles, people of European and native ancestry. New languages, religions, and traditions took root. Despite the tragedy, life continued. Native peoples adapted, learning European technologies and customs, while Europeans also adopted native agricultural techniques, medicine, and knowledge of astronomy. The Americas became a meeting place of civilizations, and this encounter would forever change the world. Finally, for the entire world, the discovery of America marked the beginning of globalization. Continents that had been largely isolated suddenly became connected. Trade, migration, cultural exchange, and the spread of technology accelerated. The world became a single, interdependent space. But the cost was staggering. Millions of deaths, slavery, destroyed civilizations, cultural catastrophes. This was no celebration. It was a tragedy. Europe rejoiced, but for countless people, the New World became a nightmare. The discovery of America changed the course of history forever. It brought triumph to some, destruction to others. And in this tragic collision of worlds, the modern globalized world was born. A world of opportunity, trade, and empires, but also of suffering that can never be forgotten. When we look back on the Age of Discovery, especially the discovery of America, one thing becomes clear. It was an era of contrasts, contradictions, and tragedies. On one hand, Europe gained wealth, new markets, and powerful empires. Entire new horizons opened up, changing the lives of millions in the old world, paving the way for global trade, and accelerating the development of science and technology. On the other hand, for the native peoples of the Americas, it was a catastrophe. Millions died from disease. Wars and violence destroyed civilizations that had thrived for centuries. The great empires of the Aztecs, the Incas, and many others were wiped out. City after city turned to ruins, and traditions, customs, and knowledge disappeared along with the people who had preserved them. Between these two worlds lay a chasm, not just an ocean, but a gulf of understanding, culture, and values. Europe saw the New World as a source of wealth and opportunity. For the indigenous peoples, these so-called discoveries meant suffering, violence, and the loss of everything they knew and valued. Yet even amidst tragedy, new life emerged. On the ruins of old societies, mixed cultures began to form. Mestizos, Creoles, and other generations became bridges between continents, connecting Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Languages, crafts, religions, and traditions intertwined, creating new civilizations. This cultural synthesis was one of the rare fruits of that historical collision. Thus, the discovery of America cannot be seen in simple terms. It was a triumph for some and a tragedy for others. It is a story of greed, ambition, courage, but also of suffering and loss that must not be forgotten. And so, as we sum it up, one question remains for each of us. Can we truly call it a discovery? America was already inhabited, with its civilizations, cities, and traditions. Perhaps it would be more accurate to speak of a meeting of worlds, a meeting that changed history, but at the cost of enormous human suffering. Think about that, because it is these very questions that help us understand the past more deeply and see how history shapes the world we live in today. Thank you for watching this video until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss new videos.